this office that the difficult decisions always come to this desk. I must admit that many of them do not look at all the same as the hypothetical questions that I have answered freely and perhaps too fast on previous occasions. My customary policy is to try and get all the facts and to consider the opinions of my countrymen and to take counsel with my most valued friends. But these seldom agree, and in the end, the decision is mine. To procrastinate, to agonize, and to wait for a more favorable turn of events that may never come, or more compelling external pressures that may as well be wrong as right, is itself a decision of sorts and a weak and potentially dangerous course for a president to follow. I have promised to uphold the Constitution, to do what is right as God gives me to see the right, and to do the very best that I can for America. I have asked your help and your prayers, not only when I became president, but many times since. The Constitution is the supreme law of our land, and it governs our actions as citizens. Only the laws of God, which govern our consciences, are superior to it. As we are a nation under God, so I am sworn to uphold our laws with the help of God. And I have sought such guidance and searched my own conscience with special diligence to determine the right thing for me to do with respect to my predecessor in this place, Richard Nixon, and his loyal wife and family. Theirs is an American tragedy in which we all have played a part. It could go on and on and on, or someone must write the end to it. I have concluded that only I can do that, and if I can, I must. But it is common knowledge that serious allegations and accusations hang like a sword over our former president's head, threatening his health, as he tries to reshape his life, a great part of which was spent in the service of this country and by the mandate of its people. After years of bitter controversy and divisive national debate, I have been advised, and I am compelled to conclude, that many months and perhaps more years will have to pass before Richard Nixon could obtain a fair trial by jury in any jurisdiction of the United States under governing decisions of the Supreme Court. I deeply believe in equal justice for all Americans, whatever their station or former station. The law, whether human or divine, is no respecter of persons, but the law is a respecter of reality. The facts, as I see them, are that a former president of the United States, instead of enjoying equal treatment with any other citizen accused of violating the law, would be cruelly and excessively penalized, either in preserving the presumption of his innocence or in obtaining a speedy determination of his guilt. My concern is the immediate future of this great country. In this, I dare not depend upon my personal sympathy as a longtime friend of the former president, nor my professional judgment as a lawyer, and I do not. My conscience tells me it is my duty not merely to proclaim domestic tranquility, but to use every means that I have to ensure it. Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
President Ford entered office in a very unique situation. The former president was about to be indicted, so he had to step down. And upon entering office, Ford immediately decided to pardon former President Richard Nixon. He delivered a speech humanizing Nixon, saying that they've been good friends and that he had a family that was struggling. President Ford also said that, how can the country be so cruel to a man who devoted his life to serve it? He stated that as one of the former presidents, he deserves a chance to rebuild himself, and that was what he was trying to do. Ford also said that in his power, he was forced to deliver the pardon because that was just his duty. He had to uphold the Constitution as God gave him the power to do so. He related to the religious public, which was now starting to go towards religion during the 70s. Ford reasoned that while he took the country's thoughts into consideration, it was ultimately his decision to deliver the pardon. He was looking out for the country's best interests, while also trying to stop from seeing a friend fall into a pit. Ultimately, the pardon of Nixon was a very controversial issue in that it brought down Ford's approval rating from 71% down to 40s, about a 30% decrease, because the country was able to move on from the Watergate incident.
Raindrops kept falling on their heads as Gerald and Betty Ford arrived in Austria. And President Ford kept falling on his head, first in Salzburg in front of Austrian Chancellor Kreisky. Hi, thanks for dropping by. Then in Michigan on a trip up the same stairs.
In 1975, upon his arrival in Vienna, Austria, President Ford slipped going down the wet steps of Air Force One. Then, in Michigan, President Ford slipped going up the same steps. During his time as president, Gerald Ford was thought of as being very clumsy. In reality, Ford was an extremely athletic person. He had started 2 positions in college football and was offered a place on the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. Declining these, he had gone to law school, but nevertheless, these offers showed that President Ford was very capable of controlling his own body. Probably, the real reason for the perception of President Ford as a klutz was due to his actions as president and his rise to the position. President Ford was never voted into the Oval Office, and didn't completely seem to know how to proceed with the position. People disagreed with his position to let Nixon off the hook, and assumed it was due to his naivety. They believed President Ford was unable to take the role as president and labeled him as a klutz in the office. These stereotypes were popularized by a series of skits on Saturday Night Live portraying Ford as barely capable of walking. Ford's clumsiness was argued, pointing out that he was no clumsier than anyone else. His mistakes were just popularized by the media, eager to show the president's blunders. These stereotypes were partially true, in the sense that Ford had not planned on being president and was not prepared to take the responsibility. He was placed in the position and was clumsily trying to understand his job. The trip on the steps of Air Force One had become a metaphor for Ford's presidency. It captured his innocence and the naivety of his position, unfairly categorizing him as a klutz.
President Gerald Ford was the 30th President of the United States, and he was the only one who wasn't actually elected to office. Upon taking the oath, he made a few key decisions which ultimately swayed the country's decision of him. One of which was the Presidential Proclamation number 4313. The Vietnam War had just ended, and there was an ongoing problem about deserters and evaders of the draft. The draft was the main way of supporting troops in Vietnam, and when people decided to just disappear when called to serve, it made supporting the troops a lot harder. This was a federal offense, but since the war was over and Ford declared it a time of peace and coming together after the tough loss, he was willing to overlook it. He passed a pardon stating that if they just returned home, that he would drop all charges against them and let them live free. The evaders and deserters did not want to go to the war, and while they had the reasons, it was completely unfair. And as with all pieces of legislation, there was high controversy over this. Many people thought that criminals and people against the war would just get away unscathed from their crimes, and this was just completely unfair. And while Ford had good intention, this ultimately hampered his political credibility because people who lost respect for him and just didn't like him anymore. And while more people were brought home due to the pardon, it didn't turn out the way he thought it would.
In 1974, the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, was amended. Here you can see some documents regarding the amendments. Originally, the Freedom of Information Act was passed in 1966 by Lyndon B. Johnson, allowing for a level of disclosure on government files. Many amendments have been made to strengthen the Act, including the 1974 Amendment. This amendment made it easier to gain material by providing more efficient and prompt disclosure. Ford had supported FOIA since he was a congressman in 1966 when it was first passed. However, due to concerns of leaks and legal arguments, along with dissent from his political advisors, Ford decided to veto the bill. Although the amendments themselves are important, it is notable to observe the fact that Congress managed to pass the amendments even over Ford's veto. This displayed the power of a majority in Congress. In addition, the passage of the amendment reflected the public's growing suspicion of government. It made it easier to find information by refining the degree of identification, setting time limits for requested response, and requiring the creation of indexes concerning records, among others. As a result, the amendment displayed Ford's lack of power and the public's discontent with government, while at the same time successfully expanding the public knowledge of government.
Dollars and some change, consumption is in the veins, and now I see it's just another pair of shoes.